In the 9th year of the reign of Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, a 13-year-old girl named Amastris celebrated what should have been a joyous occasion in the gilded prison of the palace at Persepolis. She wore silk dyed with Tyrian purple, the color reserved exclusively for royalty. Gold bands encircled her delicate wrists and ankles. Her dark hair had been meticulously arranged by palace servants into elaborate braids decorated with pearls brought from distant shores of the Persian Gulf. By every external measure she appeared exactly what her bloodline dictated, a princess of the most powerful empire the world had ever known, daughter of the great king himself, blessed with luxuries and privileges that millions of her father's subjects could scarcely imagine in their most fantastical dreams. But beneath the cosmetics carefully applied to her trembling face, beneath the perfumed oils that made her feel sick with their cloying sweetness, beneath the layers of silk and gold that marked her as royalty, Amastris was not celebrating. She sat motionless on cushions in her private chamber, hands shaking in her lap, struggling to control her breathing while her mother worked in terrible silence. The older woman's hands moved with practiced precision as she applied kohl around her daughter's eyes, rouge to her lips and cheeks, each gesture suggesting ritual rather than beauty, preparation rather than adornment. Her mother worked without speaking, her own hands betraying slight tremors, her face locked in that carefully neutral expression that all palace women learn to maintain when experiencing emotions they dared not reveal. When the preparations were finally complete, her mother stepped back and studied Amastris with eyes that seemed to be desperately memorizing every detail, as if capturing a final image of something precious before it was irrevocably lost. Then she spoke, her voice barely rising above a whisper, each word requiring visible physical effort to produce. "Tonight, your father will summon you to his private chambers. You will go when called. You will do whatever he requires of you. You will show no fear, no resistance, no emotion except gratitude for his attention and favor." The words hung in the perfumed air between them like a death sentence. Amastris nodded because nodding was expected, though she didn't fully comprehend what her mother's carefully chosen words actually meant, though something primal in her body recognized that something terrible was approaching even as her mind refused to grasp the full horror of what awaited her. She had grown up in these palace walls, had observed from a distance how the harem women lived, had understood in some abstract way that they existed to serve her father's desires and whims. But she was his daughter. Surely, that fundamental relationship made her different from the concubines and slaves and tribute offerings that filled the women's quarters. Surely being his own flesh and blood protected her from the uses to which other women were subjected. Surely her father saw her as a child, as family, not as just another body available for his consumption and pleasure. Her mother saw the confusion blooming in Amastris's eyes, saw the dawning horror beginning to break through innocent incomprehension, and something in her own carefully controlled expression cracked for just a moment before she forced it back into rigid neutrality. "You are the king's daughter," she said, her voice now utterly flat and drained of all feeling, as if emptiness was the only way to speak such words without collapsing entirely. "But you are also the king's property. Your body belongs to him by divine right. Your life belongs to him, utterly. Your purpose is whatever he decides it to be at any given moment. He brought you into this world through his seed and power. He can use you however he wishes. That is the fundamental reality you must accept if you want to survive what comes next." Before Amastris could respond, before she could ask the questions forming in her throat, but seeming too terrible to speak aloud, the chamber door opened and a eunuch entered with ceremonial formality. He was one of the senior palace eunuchs, a man Amastris had known her entire sheltered life, who had sometimes brought her small gifts during festival days when she was younger and the world seemed safe. But now he looked at her with eyes holding no warmth, no recognition of their previous relationship, only the flat assessment of someone evaluating property for fitness to a specific purpose. "The king summons his daughter Amastris," the eunuch announced in his high, emotionless voice. "She will come immediately and without delay. Her mother will not accompany her. She will not speak unless the king addresses her directly. She will obey all commands without hesitation or question. These instructions are absolutely clear. Amestra stood on legs that felt disconnected from her body, looking one final time at her mother, who could not meet her desperate eyes, who could not offer comfort or protection or rescue, who could only watch in helpless silence as her 13-year-old daughter was led away to serve the king who was simultaneously her father and her absolute master. The eunuch gestured toward the door with practiced efficiency, and Amestra followed because refusing was literally unthinkable, because her entire life had conditioned her to understand that obedience was the only possible response to royal command, because some desperate part of her still could and quite believe what was about to happen, and hoped against hope that she had somehow misunderstood her mother's carefully delivered warning. But she had not misunderstood anything at all. What happened to Amestra that night in her father's private chambers, what Xerxes did to his own 13-year-old daughter in acts that he understood as natural demonstrations of his absolute power and divine right, was something she would never speak of to anyone for the remainder of her life. The trauma marked her so profoundly that even decades later, when she had become an old woman living in obscurity in a remote corner of the empire far from the palace where her childhood had ended, she would sometimes wake from nightmares reliving that first terrible night and all the nights that followed in its wake. But before we can fully understand the horror of what Xerxes did to Amestra and to his other daughters, before we can grasp the systematic way he used his own children as instruments for his pleasure and his political purposes, we need to understand who Xerxes was, how he came to wield such unchecked power, and how Persian royal culture created conditions where such actions seemed not monstrous, but entirely normal to those who held authority. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to discover goes far beyond simple ancient history into territory that reveals uncomfortable truths about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how entire societies can normalize the unspeakable when it serves the interests of those in control, and how even the most sacred family bonds mean absolutely nothing when power dynamics become sufficiently extreme. This isn't just the story of a single monster, but of an entire system that produced such monsters generation after generation and called them gods walking among mortals. Xerxes was born in 518 BCE, the son of Darius the Great and Queen Atossa, who was herself the daughter of Cyrus the Great, who had founded the Persian Empire through conquest and brilliant strategy. His bloodline was impeccable by every measure that mattered in Persian royal culture, descended from the two most important rulers in Persian history, combining legitimacy from both founding lines, positioned from the moment of his birth to inherit the greatest empire the world had ever known. But Xerxes was not his father's firstborn son. He had older half-brothers from Darius's other wives and secondary consorts, and Persian succession was never absolutely guaranteed to pass to the eldest son according to rigid rules. Instead, it passed to whichever son could most successfully claim divine favor and demonstrate practical capability to rule. When Darius died in 486 BCE after failing to conquer Greece and suffering the humiliating defeat at Marathon, Xerxes prevailed in the brutal succession struggle, partly through his mother's superior lineage, but also through the ruthless elimination of rivals. His half-brothers, who dared challenge his claim, met with mysterious deaths or were forced into positions where they could not effectively compete for power. The official records called these convenient deaths accidents or divine judgments. The reality was far more calculated. Once securely established as King of Kings, Xerxes inherited not only his father's throne and empire, but also his father's harem, hundreds of women who had served Darius and who now belonged to his son by right of succession. But Xerxes did not limit himself to the women who had been brought to the palace from outside as tribute or captives or gifts from nobles seeking favor. He also systematically claimed his own daughters as they reached puberty, bringing them into his chambers one by one, using their bodies for his pleasure, treating them identically to how he treated slaves or war captives or diplomatic offerings from subject peoples. This practice of fathers using daughters for intimate purposes was not unique to Xerxes in ancient Persian royal culture, but he practiced it more openly and more systematically than previous kings, and his treatment of his daughters became notorious even in an empire that generally tolerated whatever actions kings chose to take. Persian kings claimed direct descent from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of the Zoroastrian religion that had become the official faith binding the empire together. This claimed divine ancestry meant that royal blood was understood as qualitatively different from common blood, as sacred and powerful, carrying divine essence that needed to be preserved and concentrated rather than diluted through marriages with commoners. The logical conclusion from this theological framework was that the purest royal bloodlines came from unions between people who both possessed this divine blood. The religious justification provided convenient cover for what was fundamentally about power and control, about demonstrating that literally no one existed beyond the king's reach, that even the most intimate family bonds meant nothing when set against royal authority and desire. Let me tell you what this meant in practice for the daughters born into Xerxes' household. These girls were raised in the women's quarters with every imaginable luxury, educated by the finest tutors, trained in music and arts, taught to manage servants, and conduct themselves with royal dignity. They wore the finest clothing and ate the best food and were protected from every hardship that ordinary Persian children faced. But they also grew up watching their older sisters disappear from the women's quarters when they reached puberty, taken to their father's chambers, returning hours or days later with something fundamentally broken in their eyes, never speaking about what had happened, but carrying themselves differently afterward as if they had learned something about the world and their place in it that had destroyed some essential part of their humanity. The younger daughters watched this pattern repeat with terrible regularity, saw their sisters transform from girls into something else entirely, understood without being told explicitly that the same fate awaited each of them in turn. Herodotus recorded the story of one daughter named Artainte, who became caught in a scandal that revealed to the wider empire what usually remained hidden within palace walls. When she became involved in some kind of relationship with Xerxes' brother-in-law that violated the absolute rule that royal daughters belonged exclusively to their father, Xerxes' response revealed the deadly dynamics at play. He didn't punish Artainte directly, as that would have required acknowledging she possessed enough agency to make choices. Instead, he punished the man's wife, his own sister, having her mutilated in ways that ancient sources describe with horror, her body systematically destroyed as both punishment and warning. As for Artainte herself, she simply vanished from all historical records after this incident, her fate unknown, her existence erased as if she had never been born. This was the world that Amestris and her sisters inhabited, a golden cage where every luxury came with a price that would be extracted when they reached the age their father found desirable, where being a princess meant being simultaneously exalted and utterly powerless, where the man who should have protected them was instead the greatest threat they would ever face. And there was no escape, no appeal to higher authority, no rescue coming from any quarter, because in the Persian Empire, the king was the highest authority. His word was absolute law, and his daughters were his property to use exactly as he wished until the day he decided otherwise, or until death released them from his control. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think about how absolute power can corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships, and how systems that place any individual completely above accountability inevitably produce such horrors. This isn't just ancient history. It is a warning that echoes through every age about what happens when we grant anyone power without limits or consequences.